Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope this video finds all of you doing very well today, wherever you are in the world. Today, if you don't mind, I'd like to share with you some thoughts that I have with respect to a very recent release from the Criterion collection during this month, January 2020. This is Spy Number 1010. This is the film that is directed by Jean-Luc Godard, and it is the film which is called Le Petit Soldat. So to be specific, this was originally made in 1960, but it had been banned in France for a number of years, only to then be released in theaters in 1963. And so the back of the Criterion cover here indicates the year as being 1963, which is considered to be the release year of this film after the ban was lifted. So this is a film that is often described as being a political film directed by Jean-Luc Godard. It is, of course, an early film in his career, coming in terms of production history quite soon after his film Breathless. And so if we're talking about the early 60s, then we are talking, of course, about the early stages of Godard's feature film career as a director of feature films, of course. So there is a lot of innovation and a lot of cleverness, and there is a lot of Godardian considerations that are made in this film. And so you are getting a film that is in many ways a typical Godard film in terms of the characters on screen and engaging with the audience, engaging with the periphery as well as the center focus of the film in terms of intellectualizing matters of the film and also trying to act with a sense of using cinema for the purposes of the discussion that is being propelled in the focus of this film. And what is this focus, that you may ask? Well, as I alluded to earlier in my comments, this is often described as being a quote-unquote political film by Godard, especially since it is dealing with this particular aspect of French Algerian history, in particular the Algerian War, that was very much part of the foreground of history of France in the 50s and then the early 60s. So this film comes during the midst of all that. The film is set in Geneva, but it does involve directly the events of the Algerian War, and in particular the concepts or the historical background that was provided by this notion of the conflict, socio-political and also military conflict that was existing at the time between pro-colonial forces on the one hand and also nationalists on the other hand, Algerian nationalists on the other hand. And so even also within the pro-colonial front, there were apparently a lot of factions at play here. So this is a very, very general way of saying that, yes, this film is described as being a kind of political film from Jean-Luc Godard. But if I may, I would actually suggest that that description is probably probably a very general one, and it might be better to try to add a little bit of detail to that description, because I wouldn't call this necessarily a quote-unquote political film per se. I would perhaps try to label it in slightly different, albeit related terms. So, for example, it could be seen as being a kind of cinematic discourse of certain matters and certain ideas regarding the nature of political ideology and also political allegiances, and also how one's political allegiances materialize in real world terms, or how they don't materialize in real world terms, how they set up one's expectations, and also how they set us up also for disappointments and failures and even shocks and surprises. So in discussing this nature of political ideologies and political allegiances and the nature of political allegiances, I think also the film can thus be described as being a kind of discourse, if you will, a cinematic discourse by Godard and company as to perhaps the paradoxical nature of the way in which the intellectualization of political revolutionary movements can sometimes lead to opposite effects. Sometimes that might lead to the dumbing down of political ideologies for ideology's sake. They might also lead to a confusion of allegiances. One doesn't necessarily know exactly if one side is in fact the right side, or perhaps it is on the wrong side of history, that sort of thing. So there is a confusion as well as to the righteousness of one's political allegiances, at least as displayed in this film, in the context of the Algerian War. That was direct part of the sort of political process and political landscape of France and the French people at this time. So, and to carry on with this, there is also, to borrow the thread of confusion, the idea of confusion in political allegiances also leading to confusion in personal relationships, and also worldviews that lead to difficulties in interpreting who's who and what's what. And if there are difficulties in interpretation as to who's who and what's what, then I think the film posits some really deep and disturbing questions as to the actual good faith nature of political ideologies, and whether or not in the modern age, in the modern society, such a thing can exist, a good faith political ideology that is fueled by some kind of revolutionary spirit on the one hand, or is it all for naught? And is it all just a kind of way of, to put it in bleak terms, promote or to devolve into some kind of form of human savagery that is bereft of any kind of philosophical moral compass, if you will? These questions, I think, are left to the viewer to try to answer on his or her own as he or she watches this film unfold. This is to say that this film, I think, offers a very complex world, a very bleak world, and it is a very difficult film to watch. But I mean that in the most respectful terms, because this film offers an incredible amount of things to consider in this landscape of the consideration of the intellectualization of political ideologies in the context of modern living society, as it were. Again, I'm being very general, but there is actually, I think I'm barely even scratching the surface at this, because the kinds of things that this film ponders can cut quite deep. and enter into the territory of the very chilling and disturbing, especially with some of the more controversial aspects of this film that this film is depicting with respect to the battle of different political ideologies, both socio-economic and military. And we see certain scenes that play out in this film that I think can really challenge the viewer in terms of what he or she is watching and it's unfolding. It's quite disturbing stuff in many respects, but it's always very thought-provoking, and it never stops being so. And I think in that respect, it is a very engaging watch, and it is certainly a film that is, in my view anyway, and I think in the view of many others who are of more they have more critical credentials, if you will, in terms of the examination of cinema. This film is considered to be quite an important film in many respects in the context of the filmography of Jean-Luc Godard. So that is, in very broad strokes, this film, Le Petit Soldat, which brings me to the Criterion Collection release here, which is, as I say, spine number 1010. This happens to be the Blu-ray right here. And I should say from the get-go that the presentation of this film as made available in this Criterion Collection release is really quite stunning. I have seen this film before, but I have never seen this film in this kind of really lovely presentation. This crisp, clear presentation is really a sight to behold. And I'm not so exact on my release history with respect to this film, but I do know that this film has been, at least in the context of English language friendly versions, it's been a little bit difficult to acquire with respect or in comparison to other Godard films, but to see this emerge in this kind of presentation by the Criterion Collection the way it is now is really a wonder, and it's a delight, and it's a fantastic addition to the Criterion Collection, as well as being, of course, another example of Godard and Criterion's relationship, as it were, or the relationship between Godard's work and Criterion. So this is, in that respect, a kind of definite must-buy. It's definitely a must-buy in terms of anyone who is interested in the works of Godard, and also anyone who is interested in the works of somewhat, at least up to now, relatively difficult to get film in good condition. This looks really fantastic in this Criterion release, so it's really worth it for that alone. And as for the supplements of this film, now there is another question. There's another issue entirely, in fact. As much as I really, really love the way this film is being presented here by the Criterion Collection Blu-ray home video physical media release, and it really is stunning, absolutely stunning. The supplements presents a little bit of an issue with respect to this Criterion release. So what do I mean here? So first of all, as far as extra supplements are concerned, one, there is an interview with the director Jean-Luc Godard from 1965. Yes, that's right. And it's an interview with him, and he is seen speaking about certain aspects of this film, Le Petit Soldat, and he's talking about how the critics didn't necessarily take to it at the time, and he's describing a little bit as to his thinking as to the reasons why. So this is in 1965, and so this is a little bit after the fact of this release. It was made in 1960, but then released in 1963, and then the interview with Godard is in 1965. It's very enlightening. It's not so long, relatively speaking, but it's really good to have Godard's direct take on how he feels about this film and what he thinks are the reasons for its, the reasons why the critics responded to it the way they did at the time. So it's definitely worth watching. That is a really a great interview to have. It's an archival interview from 1965. And then there is an interview another archival interview from 1963, this time with the actor and star of the film, Michel Subor. So Michel Subor is the actor, and he is the sort of the main protagonist of this film, or he plays the main protagonist of this film. And this is an archival interview with him. It's a very interesting interview, really interesting. In fact, I would say that in terms of the content, I would strongly suggest watching this interview with Michel Subor. And by the end of the interview, if you haven't fallen in love with Michel Subor and the kind of passion that he displays with respect to his love of cinema and his love of the craft and his dedication to his art, then I don't know what else to say, because this interview really displays his passion so well, and one, I think, becomes a fan of his almost immediately after watching this interview. It's a really great interview, and he goes into some really fascinating points as to the reasons why he thought that this film was banned in France. Again, as I alluded to, the film was banned in France for a number of years until it was finally released in '63. So it was banned, and Subor goes into reasons as to why he thinks that happened, and also he goes into interesting counter-arguments with respect to why he thinks that the film should not have been banned. Those counter-arguments are actually great. They are really great, and it shows that he is thinking about this issue very much, and he is thinking deeply and quite earnestly about this. That is wonderful. There are some other aspects of this interview that are fascinating. The whole point of the whole fact that it's shown he's being interviewed while he's practicing in a boxing gym. So he's like in his boxing getup, and he's just standing there like in a boxing gym, and it just shows him boxing. And basically, for the majority of the interview, it's just him talking to an interviewer who's off screen. And the interview, in fact, is a little bit pushy in some places. The interviewer has a little bit of attitude for some inexplicable reason. And so there are, not all the time, but just sometimes. And so it's really nice because there are some moments where Michel Subor kind of pushes back on the interviewer and the interviewer's style in a way that is very polite, and yet still it's nice to see, because as I indicated, the interviewer's attitude occasionally throughout this interview is a little bit pushy. So it's nice to see Michel Subor react in the way that he does. So that makes one, I think, fall in love with Michel Subor even more after watching this interview. It's a fantastic interview, another great archival interview with Michel Subor from 1963. Then there is an audio interview with Godard, and this is from 1961. And this is an audio interview with Godard in English. And so this is a discussion with Godard and his filmmaking in English. And so we hear Jean-Luc Godard speaking in English quite fluently, very eloquently, and in a well-mannered, sophisticated way, as one would expect from a very intelligent man like Godard. He's talking about his filmmaking craft and specific details of production and the like. So this is a great interview in many respects, because it has a lot of great information. And don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic one. However, this is the curious thing about this particular audio interview from 1961 with Godard speaking in English. This is the film Le Petit Soldat, right? And in fact, I think the audio interview in the in-disc menu description describes it as talking about a number of different topics, amongst which is the film Le Petit Soldat. So that is how the Criterion Collection menu describes the audio interview, at least as far as I can recall. That's very curious in my opinion, because I heard the interview on the Criterion release here, and I don't seem to recall any specific detailed mentioning of the film Le Petit Soldat in this 1961 audio interview in English. The main film that was being discussed in this interview was in fact the film Breathless. It wasn't the film Le Petit Soldat. And in fact, at the end of the interview, as the interview is ending, there is mention of the fact that Le Petit Soldat is still banned, and the interviewer has not yet seen Le Petit Soldat, but he really wants to. And so that's how the interview ends. So in fact, as far as I can recall, and if my memory is correct, none of the interview, substantively speaking, is talking directly about the film Le Petit Soldat, which is curious. You would expect a supplement to a release of the film Le Petit Soldat to talk directly about Le Petit Soldat, but my understanding is that the interview does not. It indirectly talks about Le Petit Soldat in the sense that Godard is talking about his filmmaking style and his craft. In the specific context of Breathless, of course, but if we think about that in the terms of his discussion of the craft in general, then of course we can apply that to Le Petit Soldat, which I understand was already made by the time the interview took place. So there is that. But it is very curious that this is one of the supplements that's included here. It's not terrible. As I said, I think it's a wonderful supplement or interview in and of itself. But as a supplement to Le Petit Soldat, I'm not sure as to how relevant it is, directly speaking. And so that's very curious for me. And I wonder why this was chosen as being one of the supplements. I suppose I could say that had this release included other supplements, because that's all there is in terms of the actual video supplements included in the disc. Had the release by Criterion included other supplements, then I wouldn't have minded that aspect of the audio interview that I just mentioned. But the fact of the matter is that this release from the Criterion Collection does not have any modern interviews. It does not have any critics or academics or experts on Godard talking about this film. It does not have any audio commentary. And this is actually, I think, a shame, because this film is very much dependent on context, the historical context. It's also a very peculiar film in the context of Godard's career. As I mentioned before, there's a very peculiar release history with this, and the ban and things like that, which is still, I think, something that is a little bit confusing, or could be potentially confusing to someone who comes to this film fresh and new, and not necessarily knowing everything there is to know about Jean-Luc Godard during this time. So, and also, this film, I think, hinges, it depends on having at least a very general understanding of the Algerian conflict. So without that understanding, I think the film has a potential of losing something in translation. Granted, it still operates very well as a kind of general allegory on political ideologies and the successes or failures of the political revolutionary spirit in modern times, as a general proposition. But I think it serves an extra power when one realizes the specific historical context of this film as it was relating to the Algerian conflict. And so without that basis, I think this film has the potential of maybe not succeeding as an artistic work as far as I think the Godard and company had originally intended it when they were making the film. Therefore, it would have been really nice if Criterion could have included, for example, maybe a supplement with a scholar talking about the film and the specific context of the Algerian war, the Algerian conflict, or having a scholar come in and sit down and talk about this film in the context of Godard's early career. That would have been really great. Having a commentary that could have talked about those elements and more and the like. That, I think, could have been really, really helpful. And the fact that those aren't there, and that we have only only archival interviews. Granted, they are great archival interviews, but the fact that we only have archival interviews makes this release, I think, a little bit. It makes one feel like there could have been more, especially when we consider the peculiar nature of this film and how this film fits into Godard's filmography. Had Criterion given us a little bit of something here, at least one maybe sit-down interview with a contemporary critic or the like, I think that would have made all the difference in the world. Still, it's a great film. It's a great release in terms of the film itself, and having the film itself in this great release is in and of itself a delight and a treasure. I believe that, and I still do, don't get me wrong. But as a whole package, as a Criterion whole package, I must say that I think, as much as I love the interviews, the archival interviews that are included here, the fact that there are no other Criterion-produced supplements here is a little bit conspicuous, and I think it would have been really helpful, especially given the need for historical context to be provided in order, I think, to get a fuller appreciation of this film, Le Petit Soldat. So that is my feeling about this. That being said, I think that the best that we get from this, in terms of a contemporary take on this film, is the essay called The Awful Truth by Nicholas Elliott, which is included in the leaflet, and also you can read it on the Criterion website directly, free of charge. This essay is stellar. This is one of the best essays in a Criterion release that I've come across. And it covers a lot of the ground that I think I was critical of just a few moments ago. It is talking about this film in the context of Godard's career. In particular, it is comparing this film with the prior film Breathless. And it does talk about this film also in the context of the Algerian conflict, the Algerian War. It makes specific reference to timing and historical timing, and it's talking about the main character, and also talking about the setting and when the date that this film begins, how that is also significant to the history of the Algerian War. It is also talking about Godard and his filmmaking and what he is doing with in terms of his filmmaking. You know, this idea of I mean, among other things. The idea is this is where the famous quote from Godard comes from. You know, cinema is truth 24 times a second. But Nicholas Elliott actually points out something that is very, very important about that quote in the context of this film, in that the full statement by the main character, Bruno, the Michel Subor character, is that photography is truth and cinema is truth 24 times a second. Meaning that this idea of cinema as truth 24 times a second in the context of this film means that this film is operating also on the notion that it is trying to engage in a discourse about the nature of cinema itself in the context of this idea of intellectualization and political ideologies. If we think about it in that context, film becomes such a powerful tool. And I'm not talking about this idea of propaganda and the like. I'm talking about this idea of the search for truth and the successes and or failures of cinema in that regard. And I think this quote that is often attributed to Godard himself, because it comes from this film, I think this is at the heart of what this film is trying to get at, in terms of cinema and truth and the hunt for truth, and the fact that one is hunting for truth or trying to seek out what is truth in this setting of confusion, darkness, and not knowing what the truth is, even when people are telling you what they allege to be the truth. And when things collide and when things contradict each other, then that creates a room of confusion that is at the heart of this film. And so I love how Nicholas Elliott really goes to the heart of that particular quote and really discusses it, and in the brief space that he has in this Criterion leaflet, he still gets at the heart of it so well, so well. And that's just one example of why I think this essay, The Awful Truth by Nicholas Elliott, is a must-read. It is an absolute must-read. If for anything, it is in that it at least covers, to the best of its ability, the shortcomings that I think this release has in the way in which I described it earlier. And in other words, the essay, I think, covers those shortcomings to the best of its ability, and I think very, very well, and with a lot of grace and a lot of respect. So this essay is well worth reading. You should take a look at this, watch the film, and then read the essay. It helps so much, so much. I don't want to end on a negative note, so I do want to say or re-emphasize that I do love that this film is available to view in the way that it is being presented here by the Criterion Collection. It is almost like a miracle that we have this film at all, given the fact that it, as I say, it wasn't impossible to get, but it was rather difficult to get, relatively speaking. But we do get this in the Criterion Collection readily available, and also given this great Criterion treatment in terms of the cover art, which is very much of sort of retro chic cool aspect, but also very sparse, and I think that sparseness and really reveals a lot about the tone and tenor of the film. Art directors Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, designer F. Ron Miller, credited here in the liner notes. So well done in terms of the presentation of this film and the cover art, etc. And I should say the cover art features, of course, the legendary Anna Karina. And one aspect of this film that is, I think, very famous is the fact that this marks, if we're talking about it in terms of production chronology, not release chronology, but production chronology. I mean, this marks the first occasion that we have Anna Karina working with Jean-Luc Godard. Of course, this film was released after a number of films with Anna Karina had already been made and released, of course. But in terms of production chronology, this film marks the first occasion of the two of them working together in cinema. And of course, it is a relationship that is very, very famous, and it's one that captures the luminousness and the cinema charm, if you will, the allure of this great figure, this icon of cinema that is Anna Karina. And so I think that alone also is a great reason to want to get this, in order to see what the camera, how Godard's camera was treating the icon that is Anna Karina already at this early stage. And I think it's very easy to see that the camera is treating her with care and with a loving care that we will see continue on in later Godard-Karina collaborations, of course. But that is, I think, another reason that this film is a great one and a fascinating one, and one that is very important in the context of Jean-Luc Godard's career. So this is the film Le Petit Soldat, released by the Criterion Collection at spine number 1010. Okay, my friends, thank you very much for your time, and if you have any thoughts or comments about this release, please let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. So until we meet again, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, take care and cheers.